Part 1. The Tragedy of David Sharp. On May 15, 2006, a 34-year-old British climber named David Sharp set out on what he believed would be the greatest triumph of his life, reaching the summit of Mount Everest without the use of supplemental oxygen. For David, this was not just about climbing the tallest mountain on Earth, it was about proving to himself that he could conquer it in the purest, hardest way possible. But instead of a moment of glory, his name would become forever tied to one of Everest's most haunting controversies. David wasn't a rookie in the mountains. Born in Essex, England, he was intelligent, soft-spoken, and had already climbed Tsewang, the sixth highest mountain in the world. He was strong, ambitious, and determined. But unlike the big commercial expeditions with dozens of Sherpas and hundreds of thousands of dollars in sponsorship, David was on his own. He had joined a budget expedition with little logistical support. That decision, whether from confidence, pride, or limited resources, would prove fatal. Everest at 29.032 feet is brutal beyond imagination. The summit lies in what climbers call the death zone, where there is only one-third the oxygen available at sea level. Every step feels like torture. Staying too long at that altitude slowly shuts down the human body. On that fateful night in 2006, David set out from high camp with a single oxygen bottle, a small pack, and very little backup. He wanted to climb Everest alone and unsupported, a feat admired by purists but fraught with danger. Somehow, through sheer grit, David reached the summit. But that's only half the battle on Everest. As many climbers say, the summit is optional. Getting down is mandatory. The descent is where most tragedies occur. And David would be no exception. Exhausted and suffering from severe frostbite, he collapsed inside a rocky alcove on the northeast route, only a few hundred feet below the summit. This spot already had an eerie history. It was the same place where the body of an earlier climber, known as Green Boots, had rested for years, becoming a grim landmark. And it was there that David Sharp sat down in the freezing darkness, unable to go further. As daylight broke, dozens of climbers began passing David on their way up. What followed has been debated, condemned, and analyzed ever since. Climbers reported seeing David alive, but barely. Some said he was unconscious. Others said he was responsive but unable to move. A few tried to give him oxygen, but most pressed on toward the summit. Why? Because on Everest, stopping too long can mean death for both rescuer and victim. Helping a severely incapacitated climber at 28.000 feet is almost impossible without a massive effort. Yet, the sight of man after man walking past David without a full rescue attempt shocked the world. Reports suggest nearly 40 people passed him that day. By evening, David was dead, frozen in the same cave that had already claimed another life before him. When the news spread, the world erupted in outrage. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to summit Everest, called it horrifying that so many climbers walked past a dying man. Was Everest no longer about adventure and camaraderie, but simply about personal achievement at any cost? Others argued that the death zone is a place where human strength and judgment collapse, and that no one could have truly saved him without risking many more lives. The debate over David Sharp's death continues to this day. He was eventually removed from the mountain at the request of his grieving family. But the questions remain. Was he a victim of his own risky decisions, climbing alone, on a shoestring budget, without proper backup? Or was he abandoned by a mountaineering community that had lost its moral compass? David's story forces us to confront the dark side of Everest. The mountain doesn't just test physical strength, it tests human ethics. And sometimes, in the thin air of the death zone, compassion itself is suffocated. Part 2. Shreya Shah Clarfine, A Dream That Turned Deadly. On May 19, 2012, A 33-year-old Canadian woman named Shreya Shah stood on the highest point on Earth. With the Canadian flag in her hands, she smiled through exhaustion and tears. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. For Shreya, reaching the top of Mount Everest was the symbol of hope, perseverance, and proof that nothing was impossible. But just hours later, that dream would turn into one of Everest's most heartbreaking tragedies. Shreya wasn't a professional mountaineer. She was born in Nepal, raised in India, and later moved to Canada with her husband. Friends described her as ambitious, vibrant, and determined. She worked in sales and business but always carried a burning desire to climb the world's highest mountain. For her, Everest wasn't just about adventure, it was about identity, achievement, and proving herself to the world. Unlike many climbers, Shreya didn't come with years of high-altitude experience. She had done some trekking in Nepal. But Everest is an entirely different beast. At 29.032 feet, the mountain punishes inexperience without mercy. Still, she joined a commercial expedition led by a little-known guiding company. The price was lower, the support thinner, and her personal preparation far less than what many seasoned climbers would consider safe. Yet nothing could stop her determination. That year, the mountain was unusually crowded. Hundreds of climbers had gathered in May, waiting for the short weather window to attempt the summit. The infamous traffic jam on Everest would soon make headlines around the world. Long lines of climbers were stuck on the narrow ridges, wasting precious hours in the death zone where every minute is a battle against time, oxygen, and the cold. On summit day, Shreya pushed upward with relentless willpower. Hours passed, and the sun began to rise. Eventually, against all odds, she reached the summit, standing at the top of the world. She called it the proudest moment of her life. But what she, and many others, underestimated was the true danger, coming down. Exhausted and running out of oxygen, Shreya struggled on the descent. The delays from overcrowding had drained her strength. She moved slower and slower, stumbling on the icy ridges. Her Sherpa guides tried to help, but even they were running low on oxygen and energy. Somewhere between the summit and Camp 4, Shreya collapsed. Other climbers passed her, and some tried to assist. But in the thin air of the death zone, every rescue is a desperate gamble. Sherpas attempted to carry her down, but her condition worsened. Her body had reached its limit. Despite every effort, Shreya never made it back to camp. She died high on the slopes of Everest, just hours after her greatest triumph. Her death shocked Canada, Nepal, and the entire climbing world. She was the first Canadian woman to die on Mount Everest. For many, her story highlighted the harsh reality of commercialized climbing. Everest had become a place where dreams collided with deadly risks, where inexperienced climbers were often lured into believing that money and willpower were enough to conquer the world's deadliest mountain. In the days that followed, heartbreaking images circulated. Long queues of climbers standing shoulder to shoulder in the death zone, waiting their turn for the summit while their oxygen dwindled. Shreya had been caught in that chaos, a victim of overcrowding, exhaustion, and inadequate support. Her family and friends mourned deeply, remembering her not as a statistic but as a woman full of energy, passion, and determination. To them, she wasn't reckless, she was courageous. She dared to chase a dream most would never even attempt. But her story serves as a sobering reminder. On Everest, the summit is not the victory. Survival is. Too often, climbers underestimate the descent, and the mountain exacts its price. Shreya Shah's final steps were taken in pursuit of her dream. And though her life ended on those icy slopes, her courage continues to inspire and caution future climbers. Part 3. Francys and Sergei Arsentiev, The Tragedy of Sleeping Beauty. On May 22, 1998, The summit of Everest witnessed a love story that ended in heartbreak. Francys Arsentiev, a 40-year-old American mother from Colorado, had just achieved something extraordinary. She became the first American woman to reach the summit of Everest without supplemental oxygen. At her side was her husband, Sergei Arsentiev, a seasoned Russian climber nicknamed the Snow Leopard for conquering the Soviet Union's 5 highest peaks. Together, they had dreamed of making history. But only days later, their names would become synonymous with one of Everest's most haunting tragedies. Unlike many climbers who relied on oxygen, the Arsentievs wanted to prove that the human body alone could endure the summit. It was an ambitious, dangerous decision. Without bottled oxygen, the risk of frostbite, confusion, and collapse multiplies. Still, the couple pushed upward, night after night, battling exhaustion, frozen winds, and the relentless altitude. On May 22, after several failed attempts due to technical problems, they finally stood on top of the world. But the joy was short-lived. Their ascent had taken too long, and they were dangerously behind schedule. Night fell before they could descend to camp. Trapped in the death zone, the Arsentievs became disoriented and separated in the darkness. The following day, Sergei made it back to camp alone. But Francys was missing. Sergei refused to rest. He immediately set out again, climbing back into the death zone with oxygen and supplies, determined to save his wife. His devotion was unquestionable. He was willing to risk everything to bring her down. Meanwhile, other climbers discovered Francys. She was lying in the snow near the summit ridge, barely alive. Her skin was pale, her voice faint, and her body frozen stiff from exposure. Some climbers tried to help, but she was too weak to move, and they too were running out of oxygen. After giving her a prayer and words of comfort, they were forced to leave her behind. The death zone allows little margin for heroics. When Sergei reached her, no one knows exactly what happened. Hours later, he was seen climbing up with a rope, desperately trying to reach Francys again. Tragically, Sergei never returned. He is believed to have fallen to his death during his rescue attempt. His body was later found lower on the mountain. Francys, however, remained where she had collapsed. For 9 years, her body rested in plain sight, perfectly preserved by Everest's icy winds. Climbers passing by nicknamed her Sleeping Beauty because she looked as if she were peacefully resting in the snow, her face framed by frost and her expression calm. But for those who saw her, she was more than a haunting landmark. She was a reminder of the risks climbers take and the sacrifices love demands. Her story spread across the mountaineering world, sparking debates about risk, responsibility, and the thin line between ambition and tragedy. Some criticized the couple for attempting such a dangerous feat without oxygen. Others saw their climb as an act of passion and courage, an unbreakable bond between two people chasing their dream together. In 2007, climbers organized a mission to move Francys' body off the main route, fulfilling a long-standing wish of her son, Paul. She was gently lowered down the slopes, finally given dignity after nearly a decade as a frozen figure on the mountain. But her story, and that of Sergei's desperate devotion, continues to live on. The Arsentievs remind us that Everest is more than just a mountain. It's a place where human dreams, love, and mortality collide. For some, it is a symbol of achievement. For others, a graveyard of ambition. For Francys and Sergei, it became both. Part 4. Hannelore Schmatz, the woman who sat down on Everest. On October 2, 1979, Hannelore Schmatz, a 39-year-old German climber, made history. Alongside her husband, Gerhard, she became the 4th woman ever to reach the summit of Mount Everest. At that time, Everest was still a relatively rare prize. attempted by a few hundred elite climbers each year. There were no crowds, no commercial expeditions, no traffic jams. But despite her historic success, Hannelore's name would forever be remembered not for her summit, but for her death and for the haunting image she left behind on the mountain. Hannelore was an experienced climber. She and Gerhard had climbed peaks all over the world before setting their sights on Everest. They joined an international expedition via the southern route in Nepal. In those days, equipment was heavier, weather forecasting was primitive, and rescue support was minimal. Climbers truly relied only on themselves and their small teams. To make it to the top was a remarkable achievement. On that fateful October day, Hannelore and Gerhard successfully reached the summit. But just like so many tragedies on Everest, the danger lay in the descent. The mountain is merciless, climbers are drained after summiting. Oxygen runs low, and fatigue clouds judgment. As night fell, Hannelore, Gerhard, and several teammates were caught above 8,000 meters. The group decided to bivouac, spend the night in the open, high on the South Col. It was a fatal mistake. The temperature dropped to nearly -40°C, -40°F, and the winds ripped across the ridge with brutal force. The next morning, the team attempted to descend, but Hannelore was already showing signs of extreme exhaustion and frostbite. Step by step, she slowed down until finally, just a few hundred meters from Camp 4, she could go no further. Gerhard and the Sherpas begged her to keep moving, but her body was shutting down. At around 8,300 meters, she sat down against her backpack, leaning back slightly. Her last words, as reported by those with her, were chillingly calm: "Water. Water." Moments later, she lost consciousness. Hannelore never got up again. Her death marked her as the first woman to die on Mount Everest. But what made her story legendary was what happened afterward. Unlike many bodies on Everest that eventually fall into crevasses or get buried by avalanches, Hannelore's body remained remarkably preserved and visible for years. Climbers descending the South Col route in the 1980s and early 1990s often encountered her, sitting upright against her backpack, eyes open, long hair blowing in the wind. Her appearance was so lifelike that many described it as if she had simply paused to rest. For those who saw her, the sight was unforgettable. A woman, seemingly sleeping, gazing out over the slopes of Everest, a ghostly warning of the mountain's unforgiving power. Hannelore became one of Everest's most infamous landmarks. Much like Green Boots on the northern route, climbers called her the German woman, and often shuddered at the eerie moment when they passed by her body on their own climbs. Attempts were made to remove her remains, but Everest does not easily give back what it takes. The mountain's extreme altitude, weather, and terrain make recovery missions perilous. Tragically, one Sherpa even lost his life during an attempt to bring her body down. Over the years, wind and snow eventually caused her remains to fall from their exposed position. And today she is no longer visible on the route. Yet the legend of Hannelore Schmatz lives on. She represents not only the triumph of being among the first women to conquer Everest but also the stark reminder that the mountain allows no mistakes. Her story is especially haunting because of the way she seemed to die peacefully, sitting and resting, as though Everest had quietly claimed her without violence. For climbers today, Hannelore's legacy is a cautionary tale. Everest demands respect, preparation, and humility. It shows no mercy to those who underestimate the descent, no matter how strong or accomplished they are. Her final image, eyes open, hair flowing, seated against the endless white, remains one of the most haunting symbols of the risks climbers face in their pursuit of the summit. Part 5. Rob Hall, The Tragedy of Everest's Greatest Guide. The spring of 1996 is remembered as one of the darkest seasons in the history of Everest. A fierce storm trapped climbers high on the mountain, leading to one of the deadliest disasters ever. Among those who perished was Rob Hall, a world-class mountaineer from New Zealand, respected as one of the best guides on Earth. His story is not just about tragedy, it is about loyalty, leadership, and sacrifice. Rob Hall wasn't just any climber. By the mid-1990s, he had already summited Everest 5 times and had become famous in the mountaineering world. Alongside his partner Gary Ball, he co-founded Adventure Consultants, a guiding company that offered paying clients the chance to stand on top of the world. Hall was professional, meticulous, and deeply respected. Clients trusted him with their lives. In May 1996, Hall was leading an expedition with several climbers, including Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Seattle. Hansen had attempted Everest the year before with Hall but turned back just short of the summit. This time, Hall had promised to help him reach the top. That promise would ultimately cost him his life. On May 10, 1996, Hall's team pushed for the summit. The mountain was crowded that day, with multiple expeditions attempting to climb during the same weather window. Delays piled up as climbers queued at technical bottlenecks, losing precious hours. Despite his strict turnaround time policy, meant to ensure clients descended safely, Hall broke his own rule for Doug Hansen. Determined to keep his promise, he allowed Doug to continue toward the summit even after it was dangerously late. By the time they reached the top, it was after 2 p.m., far beyond the safe limit. The descent became a nightmare. Hansen collapsed near the Hillary step, too exhausted to move. Hall refused to leave him. He stayed behind, trying to get Doug down, even as the weather turned. Then the storm struck with hurricane-force winds and blinding snow. Visibility dropped to nothing. Temperatures plummeted. Doug Hansen never rose again. Hall radioed down to base camp, reporting Hansen's condition and his own desperate situation. He was running out of oxygen. Frostbite was setting in, and the storm showed no mercy. Other guides begged him to save himself, but Hall refused to abandon his client. As hours passed, Rob Hall's voice over the radio grew weaker. In the early morning of May 11th, he made one last call, not to his team, but to his wife, Jan Arnold, who was pregnant with their daughter back in New Zealand. Satellite phones made the call possible, and it became one of the most heartbreaking moments in mountaineering history. Through tears and fading breaths, Hall told Jan that he loved her. He asked her to tell their unborn daughter how much he cared. And then, with the storm raging around him, Rob Hall quietly slipped away, his body high on the slopes of Everest, forever part of the mountain he loved. The 1996 disaster claimed the lives of 8 climbers, including Hall. The tragedy was later immortalized in Jon Krakauer's book Into Thin Air and the film Everest. But Rob Hall's legacy is more than just a tragic tale. He was remembered as a leader who lived by his duty to his clients, even when it cost him everything. To this day, Hall's body remains on Everest, frozen where he fell, a solemn reminder of the risks faced by guides who take responsibility for others. His daughter, Sarah, was born just months after his death, and she grew up hearing stories of the father who died a hero on the roof of the world. Rob Hall's story forces climbers and dreamers alike to ask, what does loyalty demand? On Everest, where survival often depends on ruthless decisions, Hall's choice to stay with his client remains both inspiring and tragic. He died not just as a mountaineer, but as a man who kept his word to the very end. Part 6. Scott Fisher, the wild spirit who never came down. The tragedy of May 1996 didn't just claim the life of Rob Hall. Another guiding legend, Scott Fisher, also perished in the storm. Unlike Hall, who was known for his discipline and structure, Fisher had a reputation as a free spirit, charismatic, daring, and larger than life. To many, He was the embodiment of adventure. His death on Everest left a deep scar on the climbing world. Scott Fisher was an American mountaineer and the founder of Mountain Madness, a guiding company that rivaled Rob Hall's adventure consultants. Where Hall was meticulous and methodical, Fisher was bold and passionate. He was famous for his strength at altitude, his long blonde hair, and his upbeat personality. Clients loved him because he made even the most grueling climbs feel like an adventure with a friend. By 1996, Fisher had already climbed Everest before and summited peaks across the globe. He believed in pushing limits but also in sharing the mountain with those who dreamed of it. That season, he brought a team of clients to Everest with the hope of guiding them safely to the top. But the mountain had other plans. On May 10th, as multiple expeditions launched their summit bids, Fisher's team was slowed by delays and exhaustion. Crowds clogged the route, and climbers waited for hours at bottlenecks like the Hillary Step. As the day stretched longer, Fisher began showing unusual signs of fatigue. Those who knew him said it was shocking. Scott was usually a powerhouse on the mountain. But on this climb, something seemed off. Despite his exhaustion, Fisher reached the summit in the afternoon. But as with so many Everest tragedies, the summit was not the problem. The descent was. By the time he turned around, he was dangerously weak, dehydrated, and possibly suffering from altitude sickness. His clients and Sherpas tried to help, but Fisher kept falling behind. As the storm swept in, the situation turned deadly. High winds and whiteout conditions made progress nearly impossible. One of his Sherpas, Lopsong Jongbu, tried to support him, even dragging him with a rope at times. But Fisher was too weak to continue. Near the south summit, he collapsed, unable to go any further. Other climbers, including rescuers from different teams, tried to reach him. But the death zone is cruel. Every step drains life, and every rescue attempt risks more deaths. In the end, Fisher was left where he lay, wrapped in the storm, his spirit fading on the mountain he loved. His death was devastating not only because of who he was, but also because of what he represented. Fisher wasn't just another guide. He was a symbol of Everest's transformation. In the 1990s, climbing the mountain was becoming increasingly commercialized. Companies like Mountain Madness and adventure consultants offered ordinary people the chance to attempt the summit. To purists, this was controversial. To dreamers, it was a miracle. Fisher stood at the heart of that debate, embodying both the promise and the peril of guided expeditions. When news of his death reached the world, it was met with sorrow and disbelief. How could someone so strong, so full of life, be gone? But Everest doesn't care about strength, charm, or reputation. It strips everyone down to their most vulnerable state. Fisher became another reminder that no amount of experience or charisma can guarantee survival at 29,000 feet. In the years since, Fisher's story has been told in books, documentaries, and films, most famously in Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air and the movie Everest, 2015, where actor Jake Gyllenhaal portrayed him. To many, he is remembered not as a victim but as a man who lived fully, embraced risk, and inspired countless others to chase their dreams. His body still rests on Everest, a silent marker of his final climb. But his legacy lives on through Mountain Madness, the guiding company that continues to operate today, carrying forward his spirit of adventure. Scott Fisher's death, alongside Rob Hall's, transformed the way the world saw Everest. It was no longer just a mountain of dreams, it was also a mountain of consequences. And yet, for climbers like Fisher, the call of Everest was worth every risk. Part 7. Joshua Chariot, the runner who never finished his race. When people think of climbers on Everest, they often imagine seasoned mountaineers, hardened by years of training in the world's toughest ranges. But in 2011, The story of Joshua Cheruiyot Kirui, a Kenyan marathon runner, shocked the world. Unlike the others whose lives ended on Everest, Joshua's tragedy was not just about the mountain itself, it was about ambition, identity, and the thin line between determination and fatal risk. Joshua was no ordinary athlete. In Kenya, long-distance running is almost a national treasure. And Joshua had proven himself on the track. He was young, strong, and full of pride in his endurance. Running marathons at high altitude had taught him discipline and suffering. To him, Everest was not just a mountain, it was the ultimate test of human limits. He believed that if he could conquer marathons in thin air, he could also conquer the world's highest peak. But Joshua was not a mountaineer. He had no significant experience with ice axes, crampons, or high-altitude climbing techniques. Still, like many ambitious adventurers before him, he was drawn by the irresistible lure of Everest. His plan was audacious, to reach the summit and make history as one of the first African runners to stand on top of the world. In May 2011, Joshua joined a commercial expedition on the northern route through Tibet. From the start, guides noticed his unorthodox approach. He carried himself like an athlete, not a mountaineer. He was confident, sometimes overly so, relying on raw fitness rather than mountaineering strategy. Some Sherpas worried that he underestimated the dangers. Everest punishes overconfidence more than anything else. As he climbed higher, Joshua struggled to adapt to the brutal conditions. Running marathons at altitude is one thing, moving above 8.000 meters in the death zone is another. The cold gnawed at him. Oxygen deprivation slowed his body, and every step became agony. Still, he pushed upward, driven by pride and determination. On May 22, Joshua and his Sherpa partner were near the summit ridge. Reports suggest Joshua began acting strangely, possibly suffering from high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, a deadly swelling of the brain caused by lack of oxygen. He grew restless, agitated, and refused to turn back. The Sherpa urged him to descend, but Joshua resisted. In the death zone, confusion can cloud even the strongest mind. Somewhere above 8.200 meters, Joshua collapsed. His Sherpa tried desperately to save him, but he was too weak to move him alone. Oxygen was running out, and rescue at that altitude was nearly impossible. Joshua Kirui, the Kenyan marathon runner who wanted to conquer Everest, never got back up. His death was reported internationally, not just because of the tragedy itself but because of what it symbolized. For many, Joshua represented the dangers of underestimating Everest. Fitness and courage are not enough. The mountain demands respect, preparation, and specialized knowledge. Without them, even the strongest athlete can fall. Joshua's story also highlighted the growing reach of Everest's allure. No longer was the mountain the exclusive playground of elite mountaineers. It had become a global stage, drawing dreamers from every corner of the world, runners, businesspeople, even those with little experience. But the price of admission is often death. Back in Kenya, the news of his passing stunned his community. Friends remembered him not as reckless, but as ambitious and inspiring. He had dared to dream beyond the track, beyond the marathon, reaching for something few would ever attempt. For them, his loss was heartbreaking, but his courage undeniable. Today, Joshua's name is less known compared to Rob Hall or Francys Arsentiev. But for those who study Everest's tragedies, his story is a sobering reminder. Everest is not just about strength, it is about skill, patience, and humility. Without them, the mountain will always win. Joshua Cheruiyot's race ended high above the world, where air is scarce and survival is fleeting. His dream of standing on top of Everest became his final challenge. One that claimed his life but also carved his name into the history of the world's most dangerous mountain. From David Sharp to Joshua Chariot. From the haunting figure of Hannelore Schmatz to the heroic sacrifice of Rob Hall, these stories reveal the same truth. Everest is not just a mountain. It is a mirror that shows us the extremes of human ambition, love, and sacrifice. For some, it is triumph. For others, it is a graveyard. And as long as people continue to dream of standing on the roof of the world, Everest will continue to claim lives, leaving behind stories that are both inspiring and heartbreaking. Right finger if you've followed this entire journey. Make sure to subscribe to Ben Stories, where true tales of courage and tragedy come alive. Because the mountain may never stop taking lives, but their stories will never be forgotten.